Welcome everyone. My name is Ross Upshur. I am a professor in the Department of Family and Community Medicine in the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. And it's my great pleasure today to be the moderator of this panel entitled Ethics of Adaptive Trial Designs. Now, before I introduce our esteemed panelists, and we're very fortunate today because we have three extraordinarily gifted speakers who are well conversant on the topics, just want to mention a few items about how this webinar will be conducted. First thing I want to point out is that this seminar is a joint initiative of the Public Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Ethics Network and the Global Forum on Bioethics and Research. And in fact, this particular webinar is picking up on themes that were discussed at the Global Forum on Bioethics and Research at the 2017 Forum on the Ethics of Alternative Clinical Designs and Methods in Low and Middle Income Country Research. And this is the second of three such combined webinars. And the next one will be on the 30th of November, and we'll talk about the ethics of research in pregnancy. So the other thing I want to do is just to indicate that we have a chat function, and that's more or less for exchanging greetings. But if you do have questions that you want to ask our panelists, please put them in the Q&A function. And if you have, there's a like function in the Q&A function. And if you like the questions, the more like questions that will help us prioritize the questions from the audience. Also, just to note that this seminar is being recorded and will be made available on the Ethics and Epidemics Ethics website later this week. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panel. We're delighted today to be joined by Professor Faiza Jahan, who's an associate professor of pediatrics and the head of Division of Infectious Disease at the Aga Khan University in Pakistan. Also joining us today is Professor Srinivas Murthy, who's a clinical associate professor of pediatrics at the Faculty of Medicine at the University of British Columbia. And last but not least, Professor Jerome Singh, who's an adjunct professor in the Division of Clinical Public Health at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health, as well as the director of the Ethical, Legal, and Social Issues Advisory Services on Global Health Research and Development. So welcome to the panelists. Thank you for taking time out of your extraordinary busy schedules to be with us today. And I think I'm going to just, so the first task of business is, given the complexity of the topic, we're going to start with a couple of short explanatory or illustrative talks about 3 to 4 minutes to address some of the questions. So Srinivas, I'm going to ask you to speak first as the methodologist, then I'll go to Faiza and then to Jerome. So, and once again to the panelists, thank you so much. And also to all of the attendees out there, I hope you're keeping well and thank you for spending time with us today. Srin, over to you. Thank you very much.
Of course, thank you, Ross, and good afternoon, everybody. I just want to give an overview of adaptive trials in general, because I feel like the term is used for lots of different things. You can think of an adaptive trial as something that changes during the course of a trial. And that can be a minor change, such as how you calculate a primary outcome or something like that, whereby the patient and the ethics don't really have significant issues as the trial proceeds. And that can progress adaptiveness-wise to trials that adapt in real time based on data that accumulates as the trial continues. And so you can envision a trial where arms are dropped, arms are introduced, randomization allocations are changed based on the accruing data, outcomes are changed. All of these things can possibly change as trials proceed. And all of those changes introduce lots of interesting, exciting ethical dimensions that deserve good discussion. I guess first is at the level of the regulator and the ethics boards, and we'll get into that in the next few minutes, I'm sure. At the level of the clinician, I think it's an important adaptation to think about. As equipoise, as data emerges, you can think that the clinician has a direct link into thinking about the ethics of this trial. And of course, fundamentally, the patient. As trials adapt, patients who are enrolled in the trial at the beginning of the trial may have a different trial experience than patients that are enrolled in a trial at the end of the exact same trial. And so while traditionally clinical trials are one freestanding entity whereby all of the patients who are enrolled experience the same thing, adaptive trials, like the large trials that are underway right now for COVID-19, change. And so that a patient at the beginning of recovery gets a lot of attention. For example, in March in recovery, in the UK, patients got one group of interventions, randomizations, and patients now get a very different set of randomizations attached to them. And obviously the consent form changes and the conversations with families and patients change, but the trial itself is the same. And that introduces a few sort of things to think about as regulators and ethics boards need to think about how this trial is overseen. Other trials, there's a trial called the REMAP-CAP, for example, which is an adaptive platform trial as well in low, middle, and high income countries simultaneously, allocates patients to different arms based on how well that arm is doing during the course of the trial. And so if you think about the patient at the beginning of the trial, they're randomized 50-50 to one or two arms. At patient 100, they may be randomized 75-25 to the better performing arm. And so that conversation, both at the clinician and at the patient level, is entirely different than how our traditional consent conversations typically go. And there's a lot of trust in the algorithm that determines that randomization allocation. And so it's a bit of a new time in adaptive trials and in clinical trials in general. And we've learned that these platform and adaptive trials are very useful for an emerging infection like COVID-19, but they also introduce significant ethical questions that we're here to talk about.
Thanks. I was intentionally muted. I think, no, just easy. Faiza, over to you if you'd like to share your thoughts.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Shrey, for that very good background to the methodology and the issues that are associated with adaptive trials. I mean, in principle, when we look at the methods for adaptive trial designs, it is sort of easy to understand, and intuitively it makes sense to randomize to an arm which seems to be, showing more success. And in the era of COVID-19, we have seen a burgeoning of these kind of studies of looking at multiple arms, multiple interventions simultaneously, dropping arms as we go along, introducing new ones. All of this is looks very good on paper, and as a person who has reviewed several adaptive trial designs in the COVID times in Pakistan, I am going to give you my personal perspective on the difficulties that have been and the challenges that we have faced as regulators and also the investigators who were part of this study. So when we look at it from a regulatory perspective, it seems that, and I know that in the previous PHEPREN webinars, it has been discussed extensively, that ethics review committees are not trained to understand this sort of design. A certain level of depth is required in the protocol to define each pathway to, when an arm will be dropped, when the sample size is going to be reviewed, the number of interim analyses that are required, And it is important for review committees to understand that scientific aspect of the trial, because it's scientifically very complex. Moreover, we also require DMECs, our DSMBs or data safety monitoring boards who need to be skilled at this. And the problem of pulling off this kind of study in an ongoing pandemic is, of course, there are all the limitations of, time. We need to be timely. Everything needs to be moved quickly. And there is obviously LMIC, from an LMIC perspective, we do see that, there are very few people on the ground. So the same folks who are responsible in the COVID response on the clinical side are also the ones who are managing these trials. So that kind of puts a sort of pressure and added work, all of these things need to be taken into consideration. And it's very important to make the trial the trial procedures as simple as possible, and limit outcomes to the ones which are, very specific and very focus on the more critical outcomes. Other problems that can happen in an adaptive trial in an LMIC is as Sri said, that these trials, you expect them to change very rapidly. And for a study like, for a trial which is done on a disease like COVID-19, where you expect outcomes also to change rapidly, there is a sort of urgency to intervene once you decide that you want to adapt the design in some way, to intervene as soon as possible. Now, to be able to judge that, you need at the background, you need very fast and efficient data entry systems, analysis, and all of those complexities that are required for conducting an adaptive trial need to be taken care of. Another specific challenge that we found in our site when we were doing the solidarity study was the ever-changing informed consent. It was maybe very difficult for the investigators to adapt to that change in informed consent. And as an ethics person, we felt that there was, that we could do more in terms of, ensuring that our consent procedures are defined from before, and we can quickly adapt when the trial is ongoing. So this is from my end. Thank you.
Thank you, Faiza. Jerome, over to you. Your thoughts on some of these issues about the complexities of adaptive trials.
Thanks, Ross. So I won't repeat anything that our two previous speakers have actually mentioned, but I'll just maybe mention something that's also related to ethics, and that's looking at some of the complexities that arise in governance of these types of trials. It's actually quite a complicated trial design, but besides the complicated trial design, there's also lots of complications when there's a multi-site, multi-country trial design. And so your governance structures need to be really well established and put in place. So you've got to have your country-specific protocol, you've got to sometimes have your site-specific protocol, and sometimes you've got to have your master protocol as well. And each of those different levels come with their own governance challenges. So you'll have a steering committee at a master level, you'll have a steering committee at a country level, and at a site level, you may even have a data and safety monitoring committee, or sometimes just a safety committee as well. But we'll come back to that a little bit later. But I think probably from an ethics perspective as well, very briefly, I think one of the challenges that does arise is depending on the type of study it is. If it's, for example, in advanced patients or patients with advanced disease, you may have a situation where there's no time to actually get informed consent in some instances. So you'll find that that has been the design of some of the studies with regard to COVID-19, where you're looking at very severe diseases and patients there are randomized to different trial arms. And you may find that the person may not be necessarily able to give informed consent for for whatever particular intervention they actually randomized to. So those are some of the, I think, the very brief overview of some of the ethics issues that I think are particularly relevant to adaptive trial designs.
Thanks, Jerome. I'm going to sort of go a little bit deeper into one of the issues that have already been raised. Dr. Murthy mentioned that you have a different conversation in the context of adaptive trials. And that raises the issue of how you explain and conceptualize risks and benefits in an adaptive trial, and particularly how those might be thought through in terms of these COVID-19 studies. Does anybody want to take a crack at that? Srin, can I ask you, because you're the one who raised this?
Sure, of course. I'm always happy to talk about this. And so, like, let's use the example of solidarity right now, because I think it is technically an adaptive platform study with different interventions being rolled in and different interventions being rolled out. And so from an ethics board perspective, to regulate a study being done in a specific site, the risks and benefits of, let's say, hydroxychloroquine, which has gotten a lot of attention, in March are very different than the risks and benefits of the hydroxychloroquine conversation in June, after a lot of data had already emerged, some higher quality than others. And I think that conversation and being able to pivot a conversation, namely that new data has emerged and we need to have a separate conversation based on some signals of toxicity, for example, needs to be a nimble system, to say the least, both all the way from the clinician and researcher consenting a family to the ethics board overseeing the study, from the local regulator managing the study and making sure it's safe for patients, to this global trial sponsor. All of those systems need to change with emerging risk benefits data that emerges. And in a way, our global system of research isn't nimble enough to reflect all of the necessary adaptations that are required for something as fast moving as this pandemic. And so that risk benefit conversation happens based on what the clinician sees in the literature and what the clinician sees in the study protocol, but it may not reflect the true risk benefit that's out there, and it may not reflect the risk benefit that the regulator sees when they approve a study. And so when I think about that adaptation and the requirements for it, you need to think about how our systems of research lead to a significant challenge in implementation. And I don't want to label bureaucracy as a challenge, because I think it's there for a reason, to make sure these regulations are in place. But it also leads to added challenges from the researcher and even the patient's perspective, and making sure they get the most relevant and most useful information in that conversation.
Thanks. Faiza, you were talking a little bit about informed consent in your discussion. Any thoughts about how we might, and then I'll turn to Jerome, about how we make systems more nimble to be as adaptive as the adaptive design requires?
Thanks. So I think you just need to be intuitive about these things. There is no specific set way that you can handle these issues. The specific problem that we had in Pakistan was when we dropped the hydroxychloroquine arm, and we did not have sufficient time to make changes to the informed consent process. And one of the reasons that this happened was because, like Sri said, both the investigators and the ethics committees were not nimble enough to adapt to those changes. So the actual implementation of the informed consent, although on paper and in spirit, is very much towards, beneficence and not harming the patient, but how it is being implemented on the ground is a real challenge. And monitoring those processes is even more challenging in times when, all of us are pushed for resources. So I'm not sure whether I have the correct answer here for what needs to be done. It's a very, very tough question. But I think preemptively, as we design these studies, it is possible to have, you know, different sorts of different iterations of the consent form, planning in advance how we are going to move as we adapt to the trials. In my understanding of most of the protocols for these adaptive designs, I felt that they were a little deficient in the clear explanation of, you know, so A is going to lead to B, and then we are going to do C. But if A does not lead to B, then we are going to, you know, continue with A. So I think those steps, which are maybe more sort of easy for the methodologists to understand, but regulators may have difficulty in understanding. So that clarity then can actually be part of the informed consent process as well.
Thanks, Jerome. Do you want to weigh here?
Maybe just to say that I think, you know, if you're looking at what are some of the ways to facilitate these types of trials, I think one of the important things to do is to make sure that when these trials are being designed, that they're done in a simple, pragmatic way. And the inclusion criteria needs to be quite simple. You need to have central randomization. And I think some of the challenges that have happened in the context of COVID-19 adaptive trials is that you found that I think what has actually, in a sense, damaged some trials is in some instances you found, while you need to be nimble, some of the local authorities actually included interventions that were not actually proven drugs into the local practices and guidelines. And so when you have unproven drugs being included in a trial protocol and you have the opportunity of being randomized to these interventions and these later get determined to be inefficacious, I think it is actually quite damaging to the trial, and it can result in mistrust of the trial thereafter. This has happened, of course, in several instances in certain countries in particular. And I think that this is an ongoing danger when you're having adaptive trial designs and you have different designs or different drugs being included in different countries and different standards being applied there as well. So I think, you know, while we need to be nimble, I think it's also very important for not just for the regulators to look out for this, but for the health authorities to be quite cautious about what drugs they actually include as well. And I think you also need a lot of buy-in, especially with community-based adaptive trial designs. You need to have your clinicians who are at a community-based trial to actually be okay and to understand what randomization means. And so if you don't have that at your low and middle income country level in particular, even though it applies globally, you're not going to really have true randomization. So I think, you know, you need to probably also, we talk about informing and training research ethics committees, but I think when you're having community-based randomized trials and you're having adaptive designs being applied to mild and moderate diseases rather than just hospitalized patients, you need to really train your clinicians as well, because very often these are your average GPs that are being recruited to be included in the trial. And if they're not properly trained and they don't understand the randomization process or they have biases, I think that could actually interrupt your outcomes as well.
Thanks, Jerome. This is interesting. This picks up on one of the key outcome points from the 2017 meeting, where it was noted that it's essential that the characteristics of platform trial designs are effectively communicated to local regulators, research ethics committees, and healthcare providers to gain that kind of local engagement. And that would actually help address the misperception that adaptations kind of decrease scientific rigor and efficiency. So this notion of nimbleness and needing to pivot is sometimes interpreted as if people aren't clear that they don't know what they're doing. Like you said, this worked, and now you're telling me it doesn't work. And so this kind of back and forth that often happens as evidence and our knowledge kind of converges, we need to be able to pivot that to that way. So one of the questions I wanted to pose, and it's come was one of the pre-circulated questions, was what sort of structures need to be put in place? So that amount of coordination and communication and relationship building between different communities all of us having a stake in the creation of reliable, solid evidence that actually informs practice and leads to better outcomes so that we all benefit. What sort of things do we need to put in place globally, and what sort of structures or playbook do we need to think about creating, particularly in helping low and middle income countries and the ethics committees there? Any thoughts with respect to that?
I'll go first, I guess.
Okay.
I guess as it relates, I think we've learned over these past 9 months that this type of trial design is hugely powerful and hugely able to learn quickly. And so establishing those systems going forward as we think about how to improve our health system and all sorts of different types of questions are crucial. And so are worth arguably the investment that's required, because it's not a straightforward process. And I think it's going to require a significant investment from all levels to make sure that these are done well. I think having a framework for community engagement, and I think many trials during COVID-19 have sort of rushed to get ahead and without actually going through the relevant processes for community engagement. I think that needs to be present both at the global sponsor of these global trials perspective, but also at the local level as well. And so having a committee who's ready to go, having relevant stakeholders in the community who are ready to go, and having policymakers locally who can engage with the trial conduct. I think having ethics board trainings are going to be fundamental. I think many ethics boards are new to these types of trial designs, not just in low-income countries, but around the world. And so establishing a framework for them to review these and review these relatively frequently, because the adaptations are going to come quickly. And so having an available ethics board, let's say, who can meet frequently to have the conversations required to make sure that there's oversight. And then I think the trust. I think building that trust with a few well-done adaptive platform trials is going to be important for clinicians, for patients, for everybody, for people to realize that this mode of research is useful. Because without that trust, as Jerome mentioned earlier, then this whole operation falls apart. And we need to maintain that to keep the research infrastructure going.
Thanks, man. Faiza, do you want to comment? And then Jerome, I'm going to ask you about sort of community engagement a little bit more specifically. And Faiza, if you want to touch on any of the issues raised.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add one more thing. I would even take a step back further and say that adaptive trial designs need to be part of curricula, of our research curricula that are taught at least at the graduate level. I mean, it's critical, and also, I mean, we are cognizant that this is a relatively new sort of design, and everybody's learning along the way. But there are very important learnings from this pandemic that we need to take forwards and ensure that, you know, next time, God forbid, something like this happens, and we need to roll out an adaptive trial with the kind of speed and quality that we want, we are able to pull it off.
Thanks. Jerome, do you want to weigh in on your experience of community engagement?
Sure. I think, you know, when you speak about community engagement and you're looking at an adaptive trial design in multiple settings, I think it's very challenging, because you'll find that, you know, in a typical hospital setting, there may not necessarily be a board or a community advisory board. So, you know, your nature of community engagement is going to be very different also in the context of a pandemic, because you're not going to be able to have a traditional community engagement meeting. So I think, you know, this is a major challenge for many, many low and income settings to actually have some level of community engagement that does not necessarily involve face-to-face interactions, especially in the context of a pandemic. So this has been quite challenging. And of course, in high income countries, it may be possible to a certain extent to maybe have community engagement initiatives using the internet or using a Zoom call like this. But of course, this type of platform that we are using on this call today is not necessarily going to be always applicable in a low middle income setting where you have data costs or slow internet access. So I think the question of community engagement is going to be a lot more challenging in a pandemic context where you can't actually have a lot of people in one room. There's social distancing criteria that apply. And there's also major issues in terms of technology constraints. when you're looking at doing an internet-based community engagement initiative. So I think those are some of the challenges. You may find, for example, if you have lockdown scenarios, you're not even able to have any sort of meeting, let alone a socially distanced meeting. So, you know, on your question of community engagement, I think those are some of the challenges that we're facing right now in many settings that are having adaptive trial designs in a low and middle income country context. And I think that it's particularly challenging to get the community to understand what is an adaptive trial design and how things can actually quickly change, even if you're in the same phase of a trial, because under general and regular circumstances, you may in fact, you know, be part of a phase 3 trial, and you have got what you're known, you know, what your intervention is going to be, you know that at the beginning of the trial. But of course, in an adaptive trial design, that can change relatively quickly, and getting a community advisory board to understand this, to relay that to other members of the community is very, very challenging under a pandemic context.
Yeah, great point, Jerome. I think you know, the whole concept of community engagement, and you have established community advisory boards, may be imperiled, particularly in lockdown. So you're going to have to think about processes of working, or not working so much working around that, but accommodating for that. So if we want sort of equitable benefits from this kind of methodology, we're going to have to think very carefully and thoughtfully about how we're going to engage communities in lockdown situations or with distance concerns. Great. So I'm going to start just to remind participants to put your questions in the Q&A. One question that came in, and because we've got two pediatricians on the call, was a question about whether there was any particular issues related to adaptive trial designs in children and young people. Is there any particular unique ethical issues for that patient population? Faiza, do you want to go ahead?
Sri wants me to go first.
Okay.
I think it just adds to the complexity of the entire the issue of consent when we are enrolling young children, because there is a need for consent from the a parental consent and a simultaneous assent process, which is required for children who are older than 7 years of age. And it is challenging to explain the procedures of such a trial to an adult, let alone a child. So to my knowledge, in the COVID times, the trials that have been ongoing, I think it is only the discovery trials that are enrolling children between 12 to 18 years of age. All the other trials, I think, have focused more on those who are more than 18 years of age. And there are other panelists here who may add more to this. So absolutely, it's challenging, it's very difficult, and I'm actually looking towards the experts here for an answer.
I will say, I think one of the blessings of this past 11 months, and I think we can all be happy about this, is the sparing of children, which has forced us to not have to deal with the added complexity of the ethical issues of randomizing children, especially small children, in an adaptive platform trial globally. And so, as Faiza mentions, we haven't done many studies of children, which is mostly because there haven't been that many children who have been severely affected. And in a way, that's been a great thing, because we've spared our youngest. In an opposite way, we haven't wrestled with the specific complexities and learned about how to best approach this for the next time, where children arguably may not be as lucky, as to the lessons that we can apply, as to how that process gets rolled out, what safeguards need to be in place during a rapidly evolving pandemic for children, and so on. And so I think we've managed to push that issue aside these past 11 months, which we'll need to address at some point in the very near future, I'm sure.
Thanks. Jerome, did you want to add anything?
well, maybe not from a pediatric point of view, but I'll just maybe quickly just speak on a very small point from an ethics point of view. And I think that when you're looking at, involving children in clinical trials, I think the one paradigm that most ethicists are taught and research ethics are taught, research ethics members are taught, and that they need to maybe in a sense unlearn this when you're looking at an adaptive trial design and rapidly moving pandemics, is that generally the kind of like the syllabus that you learn is you're not allowed to test something on a child unless it's first tested on an adult. And so you'll find that this is a major hindrance because it's an inhibition that you'll find that a research ethics committee member may have. And so they may actually delay the approval of the trial. And I think that, not that we've got too many adaptive trial designs for children or pediatric populations, but I think just research ethics committee members wrapping their minds around an adaptive trial design when they don't have experience on that, and also regulators in different countries actually delayed many protocols in many countries for COVID-19. And what ended up happening was that you found some protocols were not able to get off the ground quickly, and they missed the first waves of pandemics in some countries. So now you're waiting for the second wave for that to start. But of course, the efficacy evidence has been collected in other sites, and you don't really know if it'll work in your population. So I think there needs to be a little bit of unlearning and a little bit of flexibility. And we spoke about being nimble. We need to have that also now in the context of COVID-19 and adaptive trial design. And it speaks to that we need to actually have capacity building for ethics committee members and for regulators to understand exactly what is an adaptive trial design and why they need to be flexible and in the way that they actually consider these trials. And the last point that I'll make is that I think that ethics committee members and also regulators need to remember that research ethics guidelines are exactly that, they're guidelines. They're not law. So in essence, what this means is that this is usually just a guide that you should be guided by, but not that you necessarily should be bound by, and that you need to make your approval based purely on that basis. In the context of a pandemic, when it's a rapidly evolving, quickly moving pandemic, you need to have flexibility. And you'll find that if there's a new intervention that may not necessarily be available to even treat an adult, you need to actually be open to treating the child with this as well, especially if the child is going to be part of your target population.
Thanks, Jerome. Yes, I agree that the pediatric community has dodged a bullet on this one, but knowing full well that we're likely to have another epidemic of consequence within the next couple of years. I hate to say that, but I've been around long enough to think that. So there's a developing strand of questions around I will call them special risk populations. Some people call them vulnerable populations. One of the pre-circulated questions on registration was asking around whether there was any trials taking place among Indigenous groups, and if so, what ethical guidance or guidelines were being used. And then there's a series of questions about, I would say, linking to populations of disadvantage or special risk. Anybody want to take a first shot at that? Liza? Okay, go ahead.
I'll dive in. Like, obviously, the complexity is huge here. And to say that one global trial, for example, can be ethically relevant and useful for all populations, particularly Indigenous, marginalized, or other vulnerable populations in regions or countries, without local adaptations or local context-driven processes is unfair, in that you really need to integrate local experience and knowledge, but at the same time, you can't change too much the scientific protocol and the scientific implementation processes based on sort of making sure that validity across the world is intact. And so trying to walk that line between local context-driven processes to make sure that interests are met appropriately, while also being quick and getting off the ground within a few days, while also being global and generalizable, I don't know. It's difficult. And I don't know if any study has done that. I think with COVID-19, people have just pushed out the study and have done it as best as they could. And I think that is probably good enough for now, but I think building those frameworks to engage all of those populations for this next round and for the future, acknowledging that that was probably a deficiency over these past 9 to 11 months.
Thanks. Faiza, do you want?
Yeah, I think there has been extensive discussion on, how most of these trials have sort of excluded vulnerable populations or incarcerated populations, as people say. And I think children and pregnant women, by extension, are also vulnerable and incarcerated. And it's actually a very significant ethical dilemma, because you are so worried about the risks of the potential intervention that eventually when an intervention is rolled out into routine care and routine practice, it's picked up very quickly outside the regulatory framework. And this especially happens in LMICs, where a drug which has not been tested, for instance, in pregnant women, is being prescribed extensively in pregnant women in LMIC, where the regulations are less stringent. And so what that does is it deprives that population of the knowledge of the potential risks, but it also results in us ending up treating them with a therapy which may actually not work. So it's a very big problem, and I think moving forwards, we need to have this conversation. It's very important. So rather than worrying excessively about the risks in vulnerable populations, it's important to have a discussion of the risks and benefits. And once we start having those discussions, we can tease out a lot of uncomfortableness that happens, on the researcher's point of view when we enroll these kind of populations.
Thanks. Jerome, do you want to chime in on this one?
I'll chime in very briefly. I don't want to open any can of worms here, but I think the question, if I remember correctly, and of course my mind is so maybe I'm remembering incorrectly, you spoke about including indigenous populations in adaptive trial designs. And I think, it depends on how you define an indigenous population. But I think one of the challenges is that you may have certain country authorities who may be more willing to, in fact, introduce in their aspect of the trial or in their country level trial, indigenous interventions. And I think it's very important to distinguish between an unproven intervention and an experimental intervention. And I think that the inclusion of unproven interventions in clinical trial that's actually an adaptive clinical trial can potentially be quite dangerous and can have implications for both patients and institutions and for regulators as well. So I think that, when you're looking at using indigenous knowledge, it's really very important to take into account potential indigenous practices. But I think that we have to be quite careful about including indigenous treatments when in fact they may be unproven and based on anecdotal reports. And until they actually are verified and have gone at least a minimum past preclinical trial or phase 1, they shouldn't be introduced into human populations. And I think that there is a potential there for potential danger for study participants and also for regulators and for authorities as well if they make decisions that are not actually sound scientific decisions.
Thanks, Jerome. So your answer opens another. You said you didn't want to open a can of worms, but actually our participants have directed us to open that can of worms. So this notion of how we explain risks and how we disclose results is a question that our participants are interested in. So I'm going to start with 2 questions in relation to that. One is the relationship between the Ethics Review Board and the Data Safety and Monitoring Board, and how and when one should release information related to a trial when a trial arm, for example, is dropped or as we've seen recently with the recovery trial, when a trial arm shows, actually recovery had both sides of the coin, right? One arm's not working, one arm is showing benefit. And what's the best way to manage that process? And I think I'm going to go to you first, Ren, because this probably might be something you.
Yeah, no, it's with dozens or hundreds of research ethics boards involved in one specific study, and one data safety monitoring board, and communications being obviously a challenge to making sure that information gets out and clearly, and obviously everybody in the world paying attention to every small detail of any study. And so if a letter from a data safety board to the ethics board gets sent, which has happened a number of times for Solidarity and other studies, the public seizes on that because the public gets a hold of that and then is released to patients and the community about how this is stopped for this reason or that reason, likely safety or other concerns. So how those communications can be optimized is difficult with these large multi-site, multi-process type studies. And I think we just need to be as clear and focused with those communications, with non-nuanced messages where possible, to make it as relevant for everybody without interpretations being getting ahead of ourselves. I think part of the problem is how we release information publicly when our goal is to release it publicly, namely through press releases or preprints or waiting for publications, and where does the ethics boards at each individual site come into play in this regard, and whether they need to be aware of all of these updates quickly, giving the many different people who need to be informed of these kinds of processes. I'll stop there. I'll defer to Faiza, who can talk about her ethics board's experience.
Yeah, Faiza, I'll hand over to you. You're still.
Maybe I'd like to hear from Jerome first.
Jerome, over to you.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. I don't know if you have a specific question for me, but I think one of the challenges here is that I think also quite important in the context of an adaptive trial design are political decision making in different countries. And I think that we had that happen, for example, in the context of the US, where there was a lot of pressure put on the FDA to actually register hydroxychloroquine as an emergency use under emergency use authorization registration status. And what that ended up doing was it allowed for lots and lots of that drug to be provided to hospital settings. And there was very, very mixed messaging on the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine in the absence of evidence. And I think that what also that particular example highlighted is that if you have very strong political pressure on drug regulatory authorities, and these are drug regulatory authorities that are typically involved in registering a drug for indication as a therapeutic one way or the other, or to also regulate the trial of that drug. So I think that political decision making and responsible political decision making is actually quite a critical part of doing an adaptive trial design, because if you have political interference, you're not going to actually have a very good scientific outcome. And it could actually be, it could undermine trust, but it could also end up influencing your clinicians as well in your communities and in hospitals as well.
So I think Sri's comment was related to how closely DSMBs and regulatory bodies, ethics review committees should work together, how frequently they should be in touch with one another. I think the issue with having a sort of global sort of trial which is running across multiple countries is that there is going to be different levels of quality and different levels of implementation of what the original trial protocol wants. And that also includes how frequently the investigators communicate with their review committees. To my knowledge, it is the investigators who are the ones who are primarily responsible to ensure that there is a communication, that whatever is proposed by the DSMB is communicated to the ethics review committees and vice versa. So I think for adaptive trials, it's very important that there are direct communication channels between the DSMBs and the ERCs. But I also understand that, you know, in a rapidly evolving pandemic where we want quick results, it's extremely challenging to pull off. It's almost like, you know, playing an orchestra and just making sure that all the pieces are falling into place and all the communication channels are open. It's crazy, and it's easier said than done. But I believe that with systematic thinking and, you know, the kind of discussions we're having right now, we are on track to improve things as they are right now.
I want to sort of bring up the hydroxychloroquine conversation.
Sure,
again, because Jerome brings up at the beginning where clinicians wanted to use it. In May or somewhere around there, when a Surgisphere paper came out, and we all remember that paper, and it was problematic for a variety of reasons. But that led to regulators around the world seeing that study, writing letters to each of the hydroxychloroquine studies and telling them either to stop or to do a rapid interim analysis of their data to ensure that safety was present. And obviously, for a global trial with dozens of countries involved, that's ensured that, say, Solidarity, for example, paused all of its hydroxychloroquine randomizations because the logistics of having those dozens of regulator conversations was very difficult to have, and hundreds of ethics board conversations in a sort of a real-time fashion. And so all hydroxychloroquine randomizations were paused while those interim data were being analyzed. Compare that to recovery in the United Kingdom, where it's one country and one sort of central ethics board and one regulator, where they paused, but only for a few minutes, basically having one conversation with one regulator, and then they kept on randomizing to hydroxychloroquine, acknowledging no significant safety signal was present. And so as we reflect on how a global type trial can be implemented, that nimbleness of talking with all of those different regulators and different ethics boards introduces an added level of complexity that is inevitable, and there's no real easy solution to.
Thanks. But I think it really, now we're cognizant of a huge opportunity to actually learn something and start to reconfigure how we do business, so to speak. And part of that actually in terms of how ethics committees function. So one of the key findings from the 2017 meeting is that there's a need for training and support so research ethics committees can understand the methodology in order to understand the ethical considerations and the issues. And one of the things that I've appreciated about adaptive trials is how they really require methodologists and ethicists to work together. This was certainly the case in the 2014 Ebola outbreak, where we had a group that was looking at the intersection between methodology and ethics. So one of the recommendations was to talk about having specialized, centralized research ethics committees for adaptive platform trials, or for statisticians or methodologists to assist and participate more robustly on research ethics committees. So how do you see us evolving to a global learning health system to really take advantage of the efficiencies and rapidity and nimbleness that adaptive platform designs offer us? And what can we do to support, so centralized or better statistician support? Any takers on that one? Jerome.
Ross, I think that it's challenging to actually I think the most nimble way would be to have, for example, something like reciprocal recognition. I think the major challenge that I've seen is that sometimes you find different ethics committees raise different things. And you can't always assume that your national ethics committee will actually raise issues that will be the important issues. Sometimes I find that the master protocol may be reviewed by, for example, an international committee. They pick up a lot of the issues that, in fact, a local regulator or local ethics committee may not pick up. And so there is a tension sometimes where you find if you only have one ethics committee, lots of things fall between the gaps. And so I'm not totally comfortable, even though I understand fully the issue of nimbleness, but I've reviewed many, many protocols where local ethics committees have actually let a lot of things slip through the gaps. And alternatively, they're not necessarily doing that deliberately or even negligently. They may not necessarily be aware of other issues that have come up in other countries or other contexts. And so they're looking at it with a very small microscope. So I think that there's advantages and disadvantages to having both approaches, and that there's probably relative advantages and disadvantages to having a centralized approach and also to having a decentralized approach.
Faiza, do you have any thoughts on this topic?
No, I mean, I agree with what Jerome is saying. I don't have anything more to add. I think we are very early in understanding the complexities, and it requires far more discussion and more sort of consolidated learning from what we have experienced so far to inform the way forward. There is no right or wrong answer. There are going to be pros and cons for having both approaches. I think we need to find some middle ground where there is a mix of experience, efficient ethics committees, stable communication platforms between the four stakeholders of the trial, which are the researchers, the participants, ethics committees, as well as the central monitors or regulators. And those are probably, so communication is probably key, and a sort of, understanding of what to expect and what can go wrong, and having very open conversations about this is going to be helpful.
Srin, do you have any observations?
I guess one point to raise is that, I guess, traditionally, or at least historically, ethics boards may review a protocol in depth at the beginning and then look at it once every year or so as new data emerges or a report from a DSMB comes out. And I think an engaged adaptive platform trial across a world or across a region may require ethics boards to be more actively engaged during the process of the research. What that engagement looks like is obviously unclear at this point, but I think that requires infrastructure, that requires engagement, that requires funding, that requires all of the things that we think that we fund the researchers, but we need to fund the ethics boards attached to them as well, because they're as vital a part of making sure that this research is done well everywhere. And so when we think about research projects, especially global ones in different parts of the world with different funding infrastructure, thinking about how we support ethics boards attached to them is something to consider.
Yeah, thanks. That's an excellent point and music to my ears. So for many years when I was the director of the Joint Center for Bioethics, we had, so people tend to think of research ethics as this static set of commandments, rather than a field that actually has the capacity to do research itself and use kind of techniques from implementation science, quality improvement, to look at its own processes, to find ways to adapt and build its own knowledge base. And so I would think that rather than neglecting research ethics committees and this pervasive view that they're nothing but obstructionist, I think we can turn that narrative around by being part of the conversation on how we improve process and how we learn and how we translate those learnings into improved performance. Jerome,
Ross, I just want to quickly add that I think, when people think about ethicists or research ethics committees, they assume that they should only be involved, of course, at the beginning in the approval of the study. But I think, it's worth highlighting that with adaptive trial designs relatively recently, there's been a move, in fact, to rename data and safety monitoring boards, and they're now being split. So for example, the Agile trial has two committees. They have something called a data monitoring ethics committee, which is involved in an ongoing monitoring of data on a rolling basis. And they also have a safety review committee. So the safety review committee and the data monitoring ethics committee actually run in parallel. And what this means is that if you're doing this kind of trial design, this was the Agile trial that did that, you need to, of course, now capacitate your local ethicists in a country who may be part of a static research ethics committee, and assuming that they actually only have to review the study right at the beginning, and then the chair and maybe secretariat have to do ongoing certifications annually. But those people need to be capacitated to serve on those types of committees at a local level. So, if you're serving on a data monitoring ethics committee, you need to be able to know what to do when you're serving on that committee. So it's just something worth putting out there that, ethicists have to start thinking of their role not anymore as just being the initial gatekeepers, in a sense, at the beginning of the trial, but also that they have probably a role, depending on the nature of the trial and how its governance is structured, but to be involved in ongoing monitoring of that trial as well. And that will, of course, require some capacitating as well.
And that's particularly important in adaptive trials as new arms come on and some are dropped. So we're going to have to think about a adaptive ethics review as well as adaptive trial design, which rather than seeming like overwhelmingly horrifying is actually a remarkably exciting opportunity for innovation and scholarship. Faiza, do you want to add anything to those points?
No, I'm actually very impressed by the suggestion. In countries like Pakistan and other countries where we have functioning ethics boards, there is the ethics boards have a combined responsibility mostly of looking at both the scientific overview of the protocol as well as the ethical overview at the time of approval. I agree that the involvement of ethics boards for most trials that are non-adaptive are usually, at the time of approvals, at the time of extensions, and at the time of closing, and plus any severe adverse event reporting, which is being done, which is pre-planned as per schedule. So having this adaptive ethics committees or adaptive review boards is a very smart idea, and probably one of the proposals that would really help in easing out a lot of the tension that happens between ethics boards and the people who conduct the trials. Yeah.
So I'm going to try to draw together, there's kind of a theme in the questions that have been coming in around how you choose to add arms and what sort of evidence is required. So one of the questions related to, and that links back to the issues of indigenous knowledge, but how you take traditional therapies that may have evidence of benefit in certain circumstances and how you introduce those into particular adaptive designs. So the generalized question is, how do you add things in on what basis, what sort of evidence is required in order to feel secure and strong enough to add something new to the trial. I think probably on the other side of the coin, when you get a futility signal, that's fairly clear about, or you get a very strong signal of harm, or the harms exceeding the risks. But any thoughts about how we add new things and how we do that, sensitive to questions of epistemic justice, because there's a generalized concern around the world that certain forms of healing and knowledge do not get equal access to the mechanisms of evidence production, and therefore they're kind of excluded from the beginning? Anybody want to tackle that easy question? Jerome.
I'll start very quickly. I'm not going to answer your question, but I'll maybe add some coronavirus spikes to the ends of it. But I think probably what I will say is that I think a lot depends on what your local standard of care is. In some settings, you may find a health authority in a particular setting may in fact have normalized or integrated an indigenous form of healing as part of the local standard of care. And if you have an adaptive trial design and you're comparing 4 or 5 arms to local standard of care or to standard of care, you've got to ask yourself, what is the local standard of care? And that's why you find that you have different trial arms in different countries, because your local standard of care might be very different. So while you have your experimental arms being different, you may end up having an indigenous knowledge system drug, for example, or product being introduced as your standard of care comparison. So, you know, it does raise really interesting questions there, but I'm just putting it out there by saying that it may not necessarily be introduced as an experimental arm. It may be introduced in some settings as a local standard of care if it's been regularized in that setting.
Great, thanks. Srin, any thoughts?
Similarly, I'm not going to answer your question as to how we can solve epistemic justice problems around the world. I think when to decide which drug to add or which drug to not add, I don't think is unique to adaptive platforms. I think it's just the nature of when we decide anything about enough data is available, either in phase 1 or preclinical or phase 2 type studies, to do a large global study that's simple and pragmatic. And I think that threshold is varying depending on the disease and the intervention and the availability and all of these other sort of variables that would impact that adding type process. And so I don't think it's an adaptive platform feature, it's just a global research feature as to when we decide to study X for disease Y.
Liza, do you want to add anything to this?
Just that I think that this really emphasizes the role of a central oversight or scientific review committee that can make these kind of key decisions based on rapidly evolving evidence. I think the particular question from the participants was related to at what point in a trial do we decide to add an arm, and whether this is to be done at a decentralized level, like within a particular country, or it is to be done across countries. So I think I personally feel that it's better if this is a more centralized process, and a country may have the option of not adding that arm, although there are a lot of other ethical conundrums related to that. But I think it requires discussion, and there is no right or wrong answer here, but a central body would be the best one, who has access to all the knowledge and evidence and is able to synthesize it to decide when an arm needs to be added. But it's relatively easy to drop an arm, right? So you have the data, you are doing multiple looks, and you decide that for futility or for whatever, for safety issues, you want to drop an arm. It's an easy decision to make. Adding an arm is never easy. And you need to have certain, you need to balance the evidence, and basically it's sort of an activity which requires a lot of thinking, reviewing evidence, understanding, and then going back to the researchers and moving forwards.
Thanks. So we've covered an absolutely breathtaking range of topics, and I think we've really started to peel back the layers of the very large onion that is the challenges posed by adaptive platform design trials. And before we conclude, I'm going to ask raise one last question from the audience, and then I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, and I'm very grateful to the three of you for your absolutely superb answers to very, very difficult and complex questions. But just to put in the back of your mind for a couple of concluding thoughts on what you think the top 3 things required to help us move this forward would be. So one of the questions that was asked is around politics. So we would be naive to assume that these trials, in fact, any trial, I think it's not specific to adaptive platform trials, are being conducted in what is obviously a fairly volatile political situation. And there's been an attempt in certain jurisdictions to influence the conduct of science and trials. How do we best manage those realities which are evident in pretty much every system, particularly in a pandemic where everybody is desperate for good news? Anybody want to tackle that one?
How much time do you have left, Ross?
I have eternity.
Like, obviously, divorcing science from politics is impossible and probably not in the best interests of anybody. Everything is political and science is in there as well. But obviously, ensuring that facts and the scientific method is relied upon as much as possible to prove things is obviously the goal. Is it solvable with so many competing interests and so many sources of misinformation and so many different opinions and different interpretations of those facts therein? I think so. I think it behooves us as sort of the experts and people who are on this call as the experts as well to be out there in their communities, to have these conversations and not restrict these conversations just to webinars on global health networks, but also in our communities writ large so that we can teach everybody about these processes so that we can eventually get to a place where science drives an agenda rather than opinions. But I don't know, maybe that's wishful thinking on my back.
So it's an interesting point. So we're relying on the scientific method, but at the same time, trying to educate people that the scientific method itself evolves and changes. Yeah. And adaptive trials are actually a great challenge to that notion of a fixed scientific method. I won't go into the the history of Fisher and Pearson and Galton and Neyman Pearson hypothesis testing and the kind of Bayesian revolution that's on. But science evolves and grows, and we need to find a way to actually communicate that better so it doesn't look like it's being manipulated when in fact you're changing. But I think those are great points. Jerome and Faiza, any questions? Jerome, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that, usually science should inform policy and politics shouldn't inform science. I'll just leave it at that.
That's the famous now Sing maxim. We'll get it on t-shirts, so that's good. Faiza?
No, I'm not going to add anything more to that. I mean, we need to keep science and politics separate, and science is the only way to policy.
So I'm noting that we're drifting down in participant numbers, and I imagine people have other meetings to go to. Let me just say to the attendees how grateful we are for you spending time with us, and to bring this really stimulating, fascinating conversation to a close. I'm going to invite each speaker to just give us, or each panelist, 3 things that they would like to have at the top of their wish list. I know this is not going to be the most deeply considered wish list, but how we're going to move this forward and what steps we need to take to make that happen. And I'm going to go in reverse order from where I started, which means, Jerome, I'm going to start with you. And Faiza, because you're in the middle, you stay in the middle, and then to Srin. Jerome, three things.
I think probably what I'll just say is that it's important, as much as adaptive trial designs are very important to inform policies, and they are quick to do. You can enroll thousands of people literally over 9 or 10 days. Literally, that's what happened with some of the early trials started off looking at COVID-19. But I think we also need to understand that they don't necessarily always generate evidence that's going to be infallible. And so, you know, the prime example that, of course, we do know is that in some instances, you'll have the results of a phase 3 trial, remdesivir being one of them, coming up with a completely different result to an adaptive trial. So the Solidarity trial and the phase 3 of remdesivir came to very different results. And even though it was a WHO Solidarity trial that came up with the results that said that it may not necessarily be efficacious, the WHO actually went ahead and pre-qualified the remdesivir based on a phase 3 trial. So, you know, their own trial showed that it was not efficacious or didn't seem to be efficacious, but based on the FDA approval, WHO went ahead and pre-qualified it. So it's just a lesson here that you may have different trials taking place concurrently, a phase 3 trial and an adaptive trial, and you may have very different regulatory decisions in terms of facilitating access of that intervention to your population. So it's just something to bear in mind that the results of a phase 3 trial sometimes seems to trump no pun intended, seems to trump an adaptive trial design of a global trial. And that's even on the basis of the trial sponsor might end up registering that drug of that trial. So I'll just, maybe that's my concluding thought.
That's your concluding thought, okay. Faiza, any concluding thoughts or any items on a wish list?
Yeah, 3 things to really need to take care of when you are thinking of doing an adaptive trial. One, that there has to be a justification for this kind of trial design. And I think Jerome said that to some extent. Like, all questions do not need to be answered through an adaptive method. If one does decide to use an adaptive design, it's very important that funding agencies and central bodies evaluate the expertise of the committees and the researchers on the ground who are actually going to pull this off, and have to make some hard decisions based on whether they are to be included in such kind of study design or not. And the third, which is probably I should have mentioned, is the first one, is that we need to, in order to be inclusive, we need to ensure, and I think the burden of that is as much on the high-income countries as the low-income countries to adapt ourselves to do these kind of studies and ensure that we have these conversations, build all of these ethical and methodological issues in our research and ethics trainings. And yeah, so those are my 3 key takeaways.
Great, thanks, Faiza. Srin.
I'm trying to add anything more to what's already been said. I think dynamic and sort of meaty research ethics review across the world. And so that means spending money on them at institutional levels and spending training on them at a variety of levels as well. Making sure that they are appropriately empowered and engaged to think about these research protocols in a thoughtful and insightful way, I think it would be a wish list. I think the community engagement piece is huge, and I don't know how that can be solved, especially the complexities of COVID-19 and being quick, but a great deal of attention should probably be on that. And lastly, I think the justification, as Faiza mentioned, as to why we need to do these things. And like Jerome said earlier, not all studies need to be. And so firm justification as to why you are doing this, and then rolling it out from there.
Great, thanks. So one of the overarching comments that have been coming through is this interest in need for courses. So we need to develop sort of training resources to help people better understand both the sort of mechanics of adaptive trials and platform trials, as well as the ethics. So that's something that we can take forward and advocate to funders to provide support for. I think also there was a comment about how many community engagement activities are on hold virtual meetings are a challenge, but that they're still exploring innovative ways to continue with these activities. So one of the true things that's happening with the COVID-19 pandemic is that we're all adjusting and adapting in not just research within our lives, but there's actually probably quite a lot of really interesting thinking and innovation going on, and we need to find a way, and I'm hoping that PHEPREN could be a way to sort of convene some of those ways that people have adapted to the circumstances that COVID-19 has posed for us. We tend to give those sort of lesser weight as forms of knowledge because we're kind of kludging and finding our way around things because things are coming up. But I think we might be remiss in not finding ways to have more conversations about what different people, different REPs, different investigators, different regulators, to sort of convene forum where we could talk about how we've done and how we've adapted and what we think might be robust to integrate. So we would have an adaptive, that's how we would get to this adaptive ethics system, is by looking, you did this, that might work in our system as well. So a huge amount of learning to be done here, and I hope we can find some way to harness it. I do note that Heather has posted the link to the 2017 Global Forum for Bioethics on Research report on adaptive trials. We sort of started to surface some of these issues then. So I'm going to bring this to a close, and I really want to give my sincere thanks to Jerome, Faiza, and Srin for their very insightful comments. There's still a lot to be digested that's in the Q&A and on the chat line, because I think there's much more work to be done. Just to remind you again that we have our next combined seminar on the 30th of November at 1 o'clock on issues of research in pregnancy. And with that, I'm going to wish you all well. Hope that you take good care, that you stay safe, that you stay sane. And remember, our best asset is our kindness to each other. And we will get through this. So be well, and thank you very much.